Good evening. I'm Joseph Dobrian, and this is the second part of my two-part lecture on the 1968 presidential campaign. Now, when we last saw our heroes, the Republican and Democrat and independent candidates for President of the United States, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago had just wrapped up, and it was a disaster. It was badly damaged by riots in the streets. The peace demonstrators were causing a ruckus, and the cops overreacted to it, and the result was chaos within and without the convention hall. The Democrats came out of that convention in complete disunity. Their nominee was Hubert Humphrey, the current vice president, and his running mate was Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. And a lot of people thought that that was a kangaroo ticket, so to speak, stronger in the hindquarters than in the front. Be that as it may, nobody was terribly enthusiastic about Hubert Humphrey. He was basically foisted upon the convention by Lyndon Johnson, the outgoing president. And a lot of people liked Humphrey personally. He was really a lovable man in a lot of ways, but people didn't really see him as presidential material. And they thought that he just didn't have the substance to defeat the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. Now, at the same time, there was a third-party candidate, Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Wallace was running on a platform of law and order, as he called it, and states' rights. A lot of people felt that he was running a racist campaign, that he was saying covertly that he was running for president so that he could crack down on black agitators, anti-war demonstrators, and basically reinstitute the sort of de facto apartheid system that had prevailed in much of the South in previous years. Wallace was opposed to civil rights legislation. He was opposed to the use of busing to achieve racial integration in schools. He was generally opposed to the social programs of the Great Society that Lyndon Johnson had originated. So he was regarded as a threat to actually both the Republican and the Democratic candidates. He would probably win several states in the South. Some people thought that he could win as many as 170 electoral votes, that is 1/3 of the total almost. And if he did that, he would deny any candidate a majority in the Electoral College, which would mean that the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. Now, that might have been good news for the Democrats because the House was totally controlled by the Democratic Party at that time. It wouldn't have been good news for the Republicans, I'll grant you that. So it was especially important for the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, to achieve a majority in the Electoral College. Therefore, Nixon campaigned extra hard in the South. He knew that he would probably lose several of the states in the Deep South. Wallace would probably carry Mississippi, Alabama, probably Arkansas, probably Louisiana, possibly Georgia. But Nixon thought that he had a good chance of winning several other states that it looked like Wallace might win. It looked like it would be a dead heat pretty much between Nixon and Wallace in Florida, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, perhaps in Virginia, perhaps in Arkansas, we don't know. So Nixon was really focusing on those border states, those states that were not the very deepest of the Deep South, but he thought he had a good chance to win Georgia as well. And Humphrey, meanwhile, was sort of caught in the middle. He probably would place third in most of those states, but you couldn't be sure. So Humphrey did his best in those states as well, but Humphrey mainly focused on the big industrial states. And he had to have those big industrial states because Nixon was a dead solid lock to win the farm states like Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Montana, etc. So Humphrey focused on the industrial states like Michigan, his native state of Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. He was probably going to win most of New England, so he didn't worry too much about that. But each of the three candidates had their own stronghold and their own strategy. Now, going into the 1968 presidential campaign in September of 1968, it looked like Nixon was way ahead in the polls, and it looked like he would probably win a large majority in the Electoral College. But there was the question of his personal attractiveness. People just didn't trust Nixon. A lot of people just didn't like him. They didn't like that shifty-eyed expression of his. They didn't like his rather sinister, scowling aspect. They didn't like that distinctive voice of his. Oh, well, let me say this, Harry. See, it was off-putting. Meanwhile, Humphrey, on the one hand, was a very engaging sort of guy. He had this high, chirpy voice. Well, just let me say this. And he looked actually a little bit like a clown. He had these red cheeks and this rather odd mannerism about him. But he was a nice guy. Everybody thought he was kind of lovable. On the other hand, he had a lot of trouble when he was campaigning, when he was giving his speeches, especially in outdoor venues, because the anti-war demonstrators were following him. They were blaming him for having defended President Johnson's Vietnam policy. They saw him as Lyndon Johnson's tool. So he, as peaceable a man as he was perceived by these demonstrators as the pro-war candidate. Now, if there were a pro-war candidate in the race, it was probably George Wallace, who was talking via surrogates about escalating the war and becoming much more forceful. Humphrey was trying to adopt a more peaceable platform, but of course he couldn't do that without alienating or risking alienating Lyndon Johnson, who was supporting him. Meanwhile, Nixon was being very cagey about his position on Vietnam. He just said, I have a plan to get us out of Vietnam. He wouldn't tell us exactly what the plan was. We would find that out later. But he said very confidently that he did have a plan, that he would get us out of Vietnam. Humphrey was having a real hard time, as I say. Whenever he gave a speech, especially outdoors, demonstrators would try and shout him down. It's like what you see nowadays on college campuses when a conservative arrives to give a talk. They'll just shout him down. They'll try and prevent him from speaking, barricade the lecture hall, whatever. The same sort of thing was going on with Hubert Humphrey. And he just didn't know how to cope with it. Finally, his running mate, Edmund Muskie, had a pretty good idea, and it worked. He said, when the demonstrators were trying to shout him down, he got them just quiet enough that they would listen to him for a minute, and he said, okay, I've got a deal for you. I want you to choose a spokesman and have that person come up here to the podium, and I will let that person speak for 15 minutes. And then after that, you keep your part of the bargain, which is to keep quiet and let me speak for 15 minutes. And it worked. It was very effective. And after that, the demonstrations quieted down a little bit. And then towards the end of the campaign, Humphrey pretty much shifted his position with regard to the Vietnam War. He said, I am willing to stop the bombing of North Vietnam, which was more than the president, Lyndon Johnson, was doing. Johnson had scaled back the bombing of North Vietnam, but he hadn't stopped it. Humphrey said, if it'll help, I'm willing to stop the bombing entirely. He didn't say anything about removing the ground troops, but, first things first. Well, at that point, most of the demonstrators gave up trying to shout him down. At his rallies thereafter, there would be signs saying, Hubert, if you mean it, we're with you. And he started climbing in the polls. He started gaining. And pretty soon, he was starting to draw even with Richard Nixon in the polls. Wallace was still polling third, well behind Nixon and Humphrey, but his support was regional, you see, so even if he came in a poor third in the popular vote, it was likely that he was going to carry several states, which would have created a deadlock in the Electoral College, could have created a deadlock in the Electoral College. So things were pretty nervous-making. By election day, the pollsters were all over the place. One major poll had Humphrey ahead by 3 points in the popular vote. Another one had Nixon ahead by 2 points in the popular vote. Nobody knew how the Electoral College was going to turn out because there were so many swing states that could go in any direction. Some of them were three-way races that any one of the three candidates could have won. Probably most people at that point thought that the 1968 election would be decided by the House of Representatives because there would be a deadlock in the Electoral College, but nobody was quite sure. Election night, the advantage just swung back and forth between Nixon and Humphrey. Wallace, as it turned out, did carry several southern states. He carried Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. But he had run out of money fairly early in the campaign and just wasn't able to keep up with Nixon and Humphrey. So he was not able to carry any of those other states in the South that he thought he might have a chance of carrying. Nixon won in Florida, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, all of which were states that Wallace had hoped he could carry. But Humphrey, on the other hand, was also doing a lot better than expected. New York was supposed to be close. Humphrey won it in a walk. Pennsylvania was supposed to be close. Humphrey won it in a walk. He won Massachusetts, which was a bigger state then than it is now in terms of population. Ohio and New Jersey teetered on the edge all night long, finally fell into the Nixon column, but Humphrey won Michigan easily, and by about midnight, boy, anything could happen. It was very close in the electoral vote. The popular vote, actually, Humphrey was slightly ahead in the total popular vote by about midnight on election night. And Humphrey, right before he turned in for the night, he said, by golly, we just might do it. And a lot of people thought he might. But slowly it became clear that Humphrey did not have a path to victory. And with Wallace not helping him out by winning a few of the extra southern states, it gradually became clear that Nixon would probably be able to put together a majority in the Electoral College. At that point, it pretty much depended on 3 states: Illinois, Missouri, and Texas. Now, all 3 of those states in 1960 had been up for grabs, and it was generally believed that the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, had committed massive voter fraud and had caused Kennedy to carry Illinois when, in fact, the vote probably should have gone to Nixon. Same thing happened in the state of Texas. Kennedy carried it by a whisker, but a lot of people believed that that was due to massive voter fraud on the part of Lyndon Johnson and his operatives down there in Texas. Missouri also was notoriously corrupt state in those days. It had political machines in St. Louis and Kansas City, and Lord knows what they would do to tinker with the votes. So in 1960, Kennedy had beaten Nixon in all three of those states by just the barest margin, and in each case there was some question as to whether the count had been genuine or not. A lot of people thought it hadn't been, it had been subject to fraud. So now those three states were going to decide 1968 as well. Well, Texas was the first to be decided. It went for Humphrey, probably without any fraud this time. It was close, but it was probably an honest count because Lyndon Johnson was able to use his pull to get people to the polls to vote for Humphrey. That left Missouri and Illinois. Nixon had to have both of those if he was going to get a majority of the electoral vote. Now he and his operatives were working very hard in Illinois to make sure that the count was honest, that Mayor Daley wasn't able to perform any chicanery. Well, this time they were a little more diligent than they had been in 1960. This time Nixon really did carry the state. This time he did win by a very slim margin in Missouri. And by the time Hubert Humphrey woke up the next morning, it was pretty well decided that Richard Nixon was going to be the next president of the United States. This was, of course, a very unpleasant surprise to a lot of Democrats. It was, of course, a happy time for the Republicans who had been so terribly humiliated in the 1964 election. Meanwhile, George Wallace had emboldened a lot of the Southern Dixiecrat types, and he had scared the heck out of a lot of Northern liberals. So this was one of the most divisive, one of the most bitterly fought elections in the history of the United States. I was 11/12 years old when this campaign was going on. I followed it very closely. I was for Nixon. I didn't think Humphrey was a villain. I did think Wallace was a villain, although, no, he just had different values. He was a product of his time and place. But at the end, pretty much people just accepted the result. Humphrey congratulated Nixon. They remained on good personal terms. Nixon took office without any fuss, and his first term, at any rate, was quite successful. Of course, we all know about the Watergate scandal that led to his downfall in his second term. But his first term, generally speaking, he did well. He ranked high in the polls. People thought well of him. But the point I'm wanting to make here is that in that election, as bitterly fought as it was and as much acrimony as there was, people accepted the result, they accepted the process, and when the smoke had cleared, we said, it's still America, we'll go on. I am horrified at the contrast between that presidential election and every other presidential election that I have experienced compared with the one that we have just seen in 2016. We have seen in the 2016 campaign so much bitterness, so much acrimony, so much divisiveness, so much demonization of people with whom we disagree. And it is carrying over now, even after the issue has been decided. We are seeing demonstrations in cities all over America, people damaging property and interrupting traffic and so on, to protest the results of a perfectly legal election. Basically, they're a bunch of toddlers having a meltdown in the cereal aisle of the supermarket because mommy didn't buy Pop-Tarts. Now, there's plenty of blame to go around for this. We have elected a crass vulgarian who has made some very disturbing comments about women, about various minorities. But the alternative would have been a candidate who apparently was utterly corrupt, had no moral compass, no sense of right or wrong, and who clearly was intending, through judicial appointments and executive orders, to destroy the First and Second Amendments to our Constitution. So there was great cause for both sides to be very, very concerned about what would happen if the other person got in. There are some people who were sincere in their support of either candidate. There were others who did not like either candidate and was just choosing them as the lesser of two evils. But that having been said, I don't think I have ever seen such infantile, such un-American behavior in a presidential campaign as I have seen in this campaign of 2016. Now, it may sound like I'm scolding the American people here, and probably I am. I don't know what has become of our society. I'm afraid that we have become so inured to moral relativism that a lot of us just feel that there is no such thing as right or wrong anymore, that maybe right or wrong are just constructs, bourgeois constructs, if you will. And this seems to be pervading into other areas of society too. Not only do we not care about defining right or wrong, we seem to be pretending that race and gender and ethnicity are mere social constructs, unless it is to our advantage to pretend otherwise, unless it is to our advantage to break people up into various groups of oppressed persons. This has led to terrible divisiveness, terrible acrimony throughout the United States. It has also led to the debasement of our language. It seems that words have no meaning anymore. For example, anything that somebody says that you disagree with, you might classify as hate speech and try to get it banned. Well, I think there are people out there who would like to throw confusion upon us in these various ways. There are people out there who hate America as we know it today and who want to destroy it. And they will try to destroy it with devices such as moral relativism, cultural relativism, destruction of the language. Because remember, if you control the language, and if you destroy the language, then you can preside over the ruins and build it back up again. If you control the language, then you can control the way the present is perceived by the populace in general. And if you control the present, you can also control the past by rewriting history. George Orwell illustrated this in his novel 1984, in which the protagonist, Winston Smith, is employed to actually rewrite the history books. He is employed by the people who control the present to revise the past. And if you control the past, you control the future. Now, as I say, there are people in this country who hate America, who hate what America stands for, who hate the traditions of America, and who want to destroy it so that they can preside over the ruins. I am not sure what kind of a society they would wish to build from the ruins. I don't even know if they have gotten that far yet in their thought processes. But they are out there. They are especially pervasive on our college campuses, where people of this sort have taken over to a great extent the administration of many colleges and universities. They have taken over the faculty. They get to decide who gets tenure at universities, and those professors are in the business quite often of teaching these new and confused values to American students. We have seen in the 2016 election just the beginning of the results of what has gone down in our society in the past, 60 years or so. I'm saying 60 years or so because that's how old I am. That's as far back as I remember. But if you want to understand the present and anticipate the future, you must learn the past. And that's why it is important to study these presidential elections of years past. That's why it's important to look back on the 1964 and the 1968 presidential elections, which were two of the bitterest, hardest fought of all of our presidential elections, and which were models of decorum compared to the election of 2016. But you look back at those, and then you can say to yourself, well, okay, I'm starting to see how we have come to this pass. And maybe by examining the past, we can ask ourselves, how can we reverse this disastrous course that we are currently on? How can we prevent our society from being ruined? How can we finally set it back on a course that's maybe not perfect, but maybe is working towards those ideals that we used to be taught back before our society had gone completely mad? If you want to make history, you've got to understand history. You've got to learn history. And that was my purpose in delivering these lectures on the 1964 and 68 presidential campaigns, to show you a little history. And now it's up to you folks to think about how this can be applied to the current situation. How can this be applied to America as we know it today? How can we use this knowledge to point America in the course that we would like it to go? Thanks very much. Good evening.